I still remember the exact smell of that morning. Fresh coffee. Warm cinnamon rolls straight from the oven. The sound of the neighbors' sprinklers running outside our window in our quiet little suburb of Charlotte, North Carolina. Everything peaceful. Everything perfectly in place, because it was my job. That was what I did. I made everything perfect so that the man I loved could walk through life without a single uncomfortable wrinkle. My name is Ashley Carver, and for 7 years, I was the perfect wife. I don't say that to brag. I say it because I need you to understand exactly what I gave and exactly what was stolen from me. I grew up in Atlanta, Georgia. My father, Richard Harmon, is the kind of man people write books about. He started with nothing, literally nothing, and built Harmon Capital Group into one of the most respected private equity firms in the Southeast. He was tough, disciplined, and fiercely protective of his family. But more than anything, he was devoted to me, his only daughter, his little Ash. He used to say, "Ashley, baby, you remember one thing. A woman who knows her value sets her own price. Don't ever let a man discount you." I carried those words with me everywhere. So when I married Brandon Carver, I wasn't some naive girl walking blindly into a love story. I was 26, college educated, sharp, and fully aware of what I was choosing. Brandon was everything a woman could want on paper. Tall, broad-shouldered, with that easy southern charm that makes you feel like the only person in the room. His family owned Carver Construction, a well-established firm out of Charlotte with contracts across 3 states. Brandon had just taken over from his father. He was ambitious, driven, and in those early days, completely, totally devoted to me. Our wedding was held on a September evening in Savannah, Georgia. String lights over an outdoor garden. White roses everywhere. My father walked me down the aisle with tears running down his face, and this man never cried. My mother squeezed my hand before the ceremony and whispered, "He's a good one, sweetheart. You chose well." And I believed her. God, how completely I believed her. The first 2 years were a dream. Brandon and I built a beautiful life in a 5-bedroom home in the Myers Park neighborhood of Charlotte. I decorated every room with care. I learned every single one of his favorite meals, his mother's pot roast recipe, his grandmother's cornbread. I supported every business decision he made, even when my gut told me otherwise. I was his partner, his biggest cheerleader, his safe place to land at the end of every hard day. But somewhere around year 3, things began to change. It started small. The kind of change you sense in your stomach before your brain is ready to accept it. Brandon started coming home a little later each evening. Not dramatically late, just 30 minutes here, an hour there. He stopped asking about my day. He started carrying his phone everywhere, even to the bathroom, and he always kept it screened down on the dinner table. I told myself it was the business. Carver Construction had landed a massive commercial development contract in uptown Charlotte. The pressure was real. The responsibility was enormous. I made excuses for him the way only a woman deeply in love can, endlessly, creatively, and with total devotion. Then came the overnight trips. Brandon had rarely traveled before. Suddenly he was driving to Raleigh, flying to Nashville, heading to Atlanta, sometimes twice a month. And every single time he left, there was this lightness about him. Like a man stepping out of a room where he'd been holding his breath. That lightness broke something inside me. Because when your husband is relieved to leave you, even when he covers it with a quick forehead kiss and a casual, "I'll call you tonight, babe," you feel it. You feel the emptiness underneath it. You feel the performance of it. I started paying closer attention. A subtle change in his cologne, something warmer, more expensive than his usual. The way he tensed every time I walked near his phone. The way a private little smile would flicker across his face while he was texting. And the moment he felt my eyes on him, the smile would vanish and he'd set the phone face down like nothing had happened. I didn't say anything. Not yet. Because I was terrified. Because some part of me, the part that had poured 7 years of her life, her love, and her absolute loyalty into this man, was not ready to hear the truth out loud. So I did what I had always done. I kept the house immaculate. I kept myself together. I told myself I was being paranoid. Then one Wednesday afternoon in October, everything shifted. I had driven downtown to pick up Brandon's dry cleaning, 3 suits he needed for an upcoming client dinner. Walking back to my car along Tryon Street, I passed a wine bar we used to love early in our marriage. And through the tall glass window, I saw him. He was sitting across from a woman I had never seen before in my life. She was striking. I won't pretend otherwise. Blonde, polished, wearing a sleek black blazer like she just walked out of a magazine shoot. She was leaning toward Brandon across the small table, laughing at something he'd said, and Brandon was electric. Animated in a way I hadn't seen in years. Eyes bright, shoulders relaxed. That big, genuine smile, the one I used to think was only mine. The dry cleaning bag nearly slipped from my fingers onto the sidewalk. I stood completely frozen, watching my husband shine for someone else. Every single instinct I had screamed at me to walk through that door, to flip that little table over, to make a scene so loud the whole city of Charlotte would hear it. But I didn't. I walked back to my car, sat in the driver's seat, stared straight through the windshield at nothing. And then I cried, the terrible, soundless kind of crying that starts somewhere behind your sternum and shakes your whole body without making a single noise. I said nothing to Brandon that night, or the next day. I watched him carefully, the way you begin to study a stranger wearing your husband's face. 3 weeks later, I found the messages. I hadn't been snooping. Not exactly. His phone buzzed on the kitchen counter while he was out back on a work call. I picked it up expecting a contractor notification. What I found was a text thread so intimate, so shockingly detailed, that the entire kitchen seemed to tilt sideways around me. Her name was Madison Cole, and from what I was reading, she had been in my husband's life for well over a year. I sat down slowly on the kitchen bar stool, in my own home, in my perfectly decorated kitchen, and read every single word. My hands were shaking. My throat had closed completely. But the worst part, the part that turned my sadness into something colder and much, much more dangerous, it wasn't the betrayal. It wasn't even the lies. It was the very last message Madison had sent Brandon that morning, just 4 hours ago. That made every hair on my body stand straight up. Because those 6 words told me that this wasn't just an affair, and that I was already running out of time. I read that message 4 times. 4 times, just to make sure my eyes weren't playing tricks on me. Just to make sure the words were real and I wasn't having some kind of breakdown in my own kitchen on a perfectly ordinary Thursday morning. The message from Madison Cole to my husband read, Evie, when are you telling her? We can't wait much longer. Everything is already in motion. Everything is already in motion. I sat very still for what felt like a long time. The refrigerator hummed. The clock on the microwave blinked 11:47 a.m. Outside, a leaf blower started up somewhere down the street. That completely ridiculous, ordinary neighborhood sound that somehow made the whole moment feel even more surreal. Everything is already in motion. What did that mean? Telling me what exactly? That he wanted a divorce. That he was leaving? I could have handled that. It would have destroyed me, but I could have handled it. No, those words meant something more calculated than that. Something planned. The way Madison wrote it, we can't wait much longer. That was not the language of a woman simply impatient for her lover. That was the language of a woman on a timeline. A woman with a strategy. And Brandon had never once mentioned a word about any of it to me. I heard the back door open. Brandon's boots on the hardwood floor. I put his phone face down exactly where I found it and turned to face the kitchen sink, gripping the counter edge like it was the only solid thing left in the world. Hey, he said, walking in. You make lunch yet? I turned around slowly and looked at my husband. Really looked at him. His face was relaxed, open, completely unbothered. He opened the refrigerator and peered inside like a man without a single secret. Not yet, I said. My voice came out steady. I don't know how. I'll just grab something at the office, he said. He kissed me on the cheek, a quick, automatic, hollow little kiss, grabbed his keys from the counter, picked up his phone without even glancing at it, and walked out the front door. Just like that. I listened to his truck back out of the driveway. And then I sat back down on that bar stool and made a decision that would change the entire direction of my life. I was not going to confront Brandon. Not yet. I was going to watch. I was going to listen. And I was going to find out exactly what everything already in motion meant before I made a single move. The next 2 weeks were the longest of my life. I became a different version of myself during those 14 days. On the surface, I was still Ashley Carver, devoted wife, beautiful home, dinner on the table. But underneath, I was paying attention to every single detail with the kind of quiet, focused precision my father had always tried to teach me. I started noticing the financial things first. Small things initially. A credit card statement that came in the mail. A card I didn't even know Brandon had opened. With charges at restaurants I'd never been to. A hotel in downtown Raleigh on a night he told me he was staying at his project manager's house. A jewelry store charge for $1,847 that certainly hadn't produced any jewelry in my direction. Then the bigger things. I have access to our joint household account. Always have. But Brandon manages the business finances separately through Carver Construction's corporate accounts, and I had never really paid much attention to those. I had trusted him completely. But now, with that message burning in my brain, I started paying very close attention. I called my college roommate Diane. She's a CPA in Atlanta now, sharp as a razor and completely loyal to me. I told her everything. She went quiet for a long moment and then said, very carefully, "Ashley, what you're describing sounds like asset movement. He may be repositioning finances before a legal filing." A legal filing. She meant divorce papers. But it was more than that, Diane explained. If Brandon was deliberately moving money out of joint or business accounts before filing, that was financial misconduct. That was something a very good attorney would want to know about immediately. I hung up the phone and sat in my car in the Whole Foods parking lot for 20 minutes, staring at the steering wheel. He wasn't just cheating on me. He was preparing to leave me with as little as possible. He and Madison had a plan, a timeline, and I, the woman who had given that man the best 7 years of her life, was about to be discarded like I had never mattered at all. I want to tell you I cried, but I didn't. Not this time. This time something cold and very quiet settled into my chest. Something that felt a lot like my father's voice in the back of my mind saying, "Ashley, baby, don't you ever let a man discount you." I started building my own file. I photographed every statement I could find. I took careful notes on dates, amounts, and patterns. I reached out to Diane again, and she helped me understand what I was looking at. I created a folder on my personal laptop, password protected, backed up to a private cloud account Brandon knew nothing about, and I filled it page by page with evidence. I also hired someone, a private investigator named Carl Briggs, recommended by Diane's attorney husband. Quiet, professional, completely discreet. I met him at a coffee shop in South End on a Tuesday morning, slid him a folder with Brandon's schedule, his truck's license plate, and Madison Cole's name. Carl looked it over, nodded once, and said, "Give me 10 days. 10 days. I went home, made Brandon's favorite pot roast for dinner, poured him a glass of bourbon, and smiled across the table at the man who was quietly planning to destroy me. And I smiled so convincingly that he actually reached across the table, squeezed my hand, and said, "You know, Ash, I'm a really lucky guy." I smiled back sweetly. But it was Carl Briggs who called me 9 days later, one day ahead of schedule, and what he told me was so much worse than I had ever prepared myself for. Because Madison Cole wasn't just Brandon's mistress, she was someone I had met before. Someone who had sat inside my home, eaten my food, and looked me directly in the eye. Carl Briggs had a calm, flat voice. The kind of voice that probably made him very good at his job. Because no matter what he was telling you, he delivered it without drama, without hesitation. Like he was reading items off a grocery list, which somehow made everything he said hit twice as hard. I was sitting in my car in our driveway when he called. It was a Tuesday evening, just after 6 p.m. The porch light was on. Through the front window, I could see the warm glow of the living room lamp. The house looking exactly like what it was supposed to be. A happy home. A safe place. "Mrs. Carver," Carl said, "I have everything. Where would you like to start?" I gripped the phone. "Just tell me." He started with Madison Cole. Her full name was Madison Cole Whitfield. She was 31 years old. Originally from Nashville, Tennessee. She had moved to Charlotte 14 months ago, which, I noted with a cold twist in my stomach, was almost exactly when Brandon's behavior had begun to change. She worked as a business development consultant, vague enough to mean almost anything. And then Carl said the thing that made the air leave my lungs completely. She was previously employed on a contract basis by Carver Construction for about 4 months, roughly 2 years ago. She worked directly with your husband on the Uptown Charlotte development proposal. The Uptown project. The contract Brandon had celebrated like he'd won the Super Bowl. The project, he said, changed everything for Carver Construction. I closed my eyes. 2 years ago. She had been inside his professional world for 2 years. which meant this wasn't some reckless, accidental affair. This was deliberate. This was chosen. Over and over again, for 2 solid years, my husband had looked at me every single morning and made a choice. There's more, Carl said. Of course there was. M's. Cole Whitfield has been present at several Carver Construction investor meetings over the past 8 months. She appears to have a financial stake, indirect, structured through an LLC, in at least 2 of the firm's current development projects. I felt something shift dangerously inside my chest. She's invested in his company? I said slowly. Not exactly, Carl said. It's more precise than that. From what I've been able to document, it appears she has been funneling money into specific project accounts in exchange for equity arrangements that are not reflected in the official company records. I sat very quietly for a moment. Carl, I said, are you telling me my husband has been cooking his books? A brief pause. I'm telling you that what I found would make a forensic accountant very, very interested. I thanked him, asked him to send everything to the secure email address we had agreed on. And then I sat in that driveway for a long time in the dark, while the porch light glowed through the window and the house looked like a perfect home that belonged to a perfect family. But that wasn't even the part that broke me completely open. That came from the second thing Carl told me, almost as an afterthought, near the end of the call. One more thing, Mrs. Carver. I cross-referenced M's. Cole's social history with your own. You have a mutual connection. A woman named Jennifer Aldridge. Everything stopped. Jennifer Aldridge was one of my closest friends. We had met through a charity gala 4 years ago, the kind of women's network event Charlotte is full of. We had clicked immediately. She was funny, warm, stylish. We had brunch together at least twice a month. She had been inside my home a dozen times. She had sat at my kitchen table. She had hugged me. She had listened to me talk about my marriage, my fears, my hopes. How are they connected? I whispered. College roommates, Carl said. University of Tennessee. 4 years together. Jennifer had introduced Madison to Charlotte's social scene, which meant Jennifer, my friend, had almost certainly known about the affair. For how long, I couldn't yet say. But she had known. And she had sat across from me at brunch, smiled her warm smile, asked about Brandon, and said absolutely nothing. I went inside the house that night, and I was so calm it frightened even me. Brandon was on the couch watching football. He looked up when I walked in and said, "Hey babe, there's leftover pizza in the kitchen." Just like that. Just like a normal Tuesday. Just like a man without a single thing to hide. I said, "Thanks, hun," went upstairs, locked the bathroom door, sat on the cold tile floor, and finally let myself fall completely apart. I cried in a way I hadn't cried since my grandmother's funeral. Deep, ugly, breathless crying. The kind that empties you out entirely. I cried for the 7 years. For the white roses at my Savannah wedding. For every meal I'd cooked, every trip I'd supported, every night I'd reached for him and told myself the distance between us was just stress, just work, just a phase we'd get through together. I cried for Jennifer, for the brunches, for the conversations where I'd been completely, vulnerably honest about my marriage while she sat there knowing exactly what was happening inside it. I cried for the woman I had been, the trusting, devoted, discounted woman. And then I stood up, washed my face with cold water, looked at myself in the mirror for a long, steady moment, and made a decision. No more crying. Not one more single tear for Brandon Carver or anyone connected to him. I picked up my phone and scrolled to a contact I hadn't called in 3 weeks. A name that always made me feel both completely safe and quietly powerful at the same time. Dad. My finger hovered over the call button. Because once I made this call, there was no going back. My father was not a man who responded to betrayal with words. Richard Harmon responded with consequences. Permanent, precise, devastating consequences. I pressed call. It rang twice. He picked up. And the moment he heard my voice, just 3 broken words, I heard his entire tone shift into something I had only witnessed once before in my life. And God help anyone who was in his way. "Daddy," I whispered. He hurt me. 3 words. That was all I managed before my voice completely gave out. There was a silence on the other end of the line. Not the silence of a man who didn't know what to say. It was the silence of a man who was very carefully deciding what he was going to do next. I'd only heard that particular silence from my father once before, when I was 17 and a boy from my high school had grabbed my wrist in a parking lot. That boy had transferred schools 2 weeks later. His father had lost a significant construction contract with the city of Atlanta shortly after that. My father did not make threats. He made adjustments. Ashley. His voice was quiet, controlled, almost gentle. Where are you right now? Upstairs bathroom, I whispered. He's downstairs. Are you safe in this moment? Yes. Another pause. Then, I need you to listen to me very carefully, baby girl. Do not say anything to him tonight. Do not change your behavior. You go downstairs, you act completely normal, and tomorrow morning when he leaves for work, you call me back. Can you do that? Yes, sir, I said, just like I was 17 again. Good girl, he said. And then, so quietly I almost didn't catch it. Nobody hurts my daughter and walks away clean. Nobody. I went downstairs, sat on the couch next to Brandon, watched the last quarter of the football game. When he put his arm around me, I leaned into him. When he laughed at a commercial, I smiled. I gave the performance of my entire life that night, sitting beside the man who had been systematically betraying me for 2 years, and I never cracked once. Brandon fell asleep before 11. I lay in the dark beside him, staring at the ceiling, completely still. And I planned. My father arrived in Charlotte 2 days later. He didn't fly commercial. Richard Harmon had not flown commercial in 15 years. He came in on his private plane, landed at Douglas International, and was sitting in the corner booth of a quiet restaurant in Dilworth by 10 a.m., 2 hours after Brandon had left for the office. I walked in, and he stood up immediately. He was 64 years old, silver-haired, impeccably dressed in a charcoal suit. He was not a tall man, but he had a presence that made every room feel like it reorganized itself around him. He opened his arms, and I walked straight into them and held on for a long moment. Then we sat down, and I told him everything. I showed him the photographs Carl had sent, the financial documents, the credit card statements, the hotel receipts. I walked him through Diane's analysis of the account movements. I told him about Madison Cole Whitfield, her hidden equity arrangements, the off-books financial structures Carl had identified. I told him about Jennifer Aldridge. My father listened to all of it without a single interruption. He sat with his hands folded on the table, his reading glasses on, going through every document I had printed and organized into a neat folder. His expression never changed. That was the most frightening thing about Richard Harmon, his absolute stillness when he was truly, deeply angry. When I finished, he took his glasses off, folded them carefully, and placed them in his breast pocket. You said he heard you, Dad said quietly. I need to know exactly what that means, Ashley. I had been dreading this part. I told him about the night 3 weeks before I found the messages. Brandon had come home late, smelling different, and I had, not accusingly, just gently, asked where he'd been. What followed had started as an argument and escalated in a way it never had before in 7 years of marriage. Brandon had grabbed my arm so hard he left bruises. He had shoved me against the bedroom wall. He had stood over me with a fury in his eyes that I had never seen before and said, "You need to learn to mind your business, Ashley." I mean it. I had photographed the bruises the next morning. They were in the folder. My father looked at the photograph for a long time without speaking. When he finally looked up, his eyes were completely dry and utterly cold. "All right," he said simply. He closed the folder, picked up his coffee cup, took one calm sip, and then said, "I'm going to need to make a few phone calls this afternoon. In the meantime, I have someone I want you to meet." Her name was Sandra O'Kafer. She was a family law attorney out of Charlotte, one of the most respected in North Carolina, according to my father, who had apparently already done his research on the flight down. She was sharp, thorough, and according to Dad, she has never lost a case where her client had documentation like yours. Sandra and I met that same afternoon at her office on South Tryon Street. She went through my folder with the focused intensity of a surgeon. Occasionally, she would nod slowly. Once she let out a low whistle at the financial documents. At the end of our meeting, she looked at me across her desk and said, "Mrs. Carver, when your husband's attorney sees what you have, I want to be in the room to watch his face." I almost smiled for the first time in weeks. But it was what my father did after that meeting that truly set everything into motion. He made 3 phone calls that evening. I was only present for one of them, and even that one I only heard his side of. But I knew my father's network. Richard Harmon had spent 40 years building relationships with the most powerful people in Atlanta, Charlotte, Nashville, and Washington. Bankers, developers, city officials, people who owed him favors and people who simply respected him enough to listen when he spoke. By the next morning, two of Carver Construction's largest project financing partners had quietly requested emergency audits of their joint accounts with the firm. Brandon called me at noon, his voice tight and confused, saying something had come up with the business and he'd be home late. I said, "Of course, honey. I'll keep dinner warm." And then I hung up, looked across the kitchen at my father who was sitting calmly at my counter drinking his coffee. And for the first time since this entire nightmare began, I felt the balance of power shift. But neither of us could have predicted what Brandon would do when he felt cornered. Because a desperate man with everything to lose is the most dangerous kind. And that evening when Brandon walked through our front door and looked at my father sitting in his kitchen, something behind his eyes went completely dark. What happened in the next 60 minutes inside that house would force me to make the hardest phone call of my life and end three people's worlds before midnight. Brandon walked through the front door at 7:43 p.m. I know the exact time because I looked at the kitchen clock the moment I heard his key in the lock. I had been sitting at the kitchen table with my father for the past 2 hours. We had eaten dinner. We had talked quietly. My father had refilled his coffee twice. He was completely, almost unnervingly calm, the way a storm is calm before it becomes something that rearranges the landscape permanently. Brandon stepped into the kitchen and stopped. He looked at my father, then at me, then back at my father. Something moved across his face, surprise first, then confusion, then something that looked very much like the beginning of fear. "Richard," he said carefully, "I didn't know you were in town." My father looked up from his coffee cup with an expression of almost pleasant neutrality. "Brandon," he said, "sit down, son." Nobody called Brandon son like that and meant anything good by it. Brandon sat down slowly. He loosened his tie. He looked at me with a question in his eyes, and I held his gaze and said absolutely nothing. I had rehearsed this moment in my head 100 times over the past 72 hours, and I had decided that when it finally arrived, I would not cry. I would not raise my voice, and I would not give him the satisfaction of watching me fall apart. My father opened the folder on the table and slid it across to Brandon without a word. Brandon looked down at it. He didn't touch it immediately. Then, slowly, he picked up the first page. The hotel receipts. His jaw tightened. He picked up the next page. The credit card statements. A muscle in his cheek began to twitch. Then he got to the financial documents, the off-books equity arrangements, the account movements, the LLC structures that Diane and Carl had pieced together. He put the papers down. "Ashley," he started. "Don't," I said quietly. Just that one word. He looked at my father, and I watched Brandon Carver, this broad-shouldered, charming, confident man who had once made an entire room gravitate toward him, visibly shrink. "Whatever you think you know," he began again. "Brandon." My father's voice was so calm, it was almost kind. "There is a forensic accounting firm currently reviewing Carver Construction's financial records at the request of two of your primary project financing partners. There is a family law attorney who will be filing papers first thing tomorrow morning. And there is a folder in front of you that contains enough documentation to support both of those processes very thoroughly." He paused. "So I would encourage you very strongly to choose your next words with great care." The silence in that kitchen was absolute. And then Brandon did the thing I'd feared most. The thing I had prayed he wouldn't do. He stood up. His chair scraped back hard against the hardwood floor. His face had gone a deep, ugly red. 7 years of knowing this man told me immediately he wasn't going to negotiate. He wasn't going to crumble. He was going to attack, because that was what Brandon Carver did when he felt cornered and exposed. He swung at problems. He always had. "You went to your daddy?" he said, his voice dropping into something low and contemptuous. "Are you serious right now, Ashley? You went running to your daddy like a little." "Careful," my father said. One word. "Absolutely level." Brennan turned on him. "With all due respect, Richard, this is between me and my wife. This is our marriage and our business, and you need to stay the hell out of." He took one step toward me. My father stood up. Now, my father was not a physically imposing man in the traditional sense. He was not Brandon's height. He was 64 years old. But I watched Brandon stop mid-step as my father rose from that chair. And I understood something I had always known intuitively, but was seeing demonstrated in real time. True power has nothing to do with size. It has everything to do with certainty. And Richard Harmon was the most certain human being I had ever encountered in my life. "Sit back down," my father said, "or I make the next call right now." Brandon's hands were shaking. "What next call? What does that even mean?" "It means," my father said quietly, "that I have not yet contacted the Charlotte Business Journal. I have not yet spoken to the 2 city council members who approved the uptown development permits. Permits that were obtained using financial projections I now have documented reason to believe were fraudulent. I have not yet returned the call from Brandon's largest private investor, a man I have known personally for 22 years, who called me this morning very concerned about some irregularities his team had flagged." He paused, picked up his coffee, took a calm sip. "I have been very patient this evening, Brandon. Do not use it up." Brandon sat back down. What followed was not dramatic. It was not loud. It was the quietest, most devastating conversation I had ever witnessed. My father and Brandon talked for 40 minutes. Sandra O'Kafer was on speakerphone for the last 20. By the end of it, Brandon had agreed to a full financial disclosure, a fair division of assets, and a non-contested divorce filing. He left our house that night with a single bag. He slept at a hotel. I know this because Carl Briggs, still on retainer, confirmed it the next morning. The divorce was finalized 4 months later. Ashley Carver became Ashley Harmon again. I moved back to Atlanta temporarily, back into the house I had grown up in, back into the guest room with the yellow curtains my mother had never changed. I slept for approximately 11 hours every night for 2 weeks. My mother made me breakfast every morning without asking what I wanted and somehow always made exactly the right thing. My father never once said "I told you so." He never referenced Brandon's name at all after the papers were signed. He simply went back to his life and made sure mine was protected. Carver Construction's financial irregularities triggered a full regulatory review. 2 of the off-books arrangements Madison Cole Whitfield had structured were flagged for fraud investigation. The firm lost its 2 largest contracts within 60 days. Brandon's attorney later told Sandra, somewhat incredulously, that he had never seen a company unravel so completely, so quickly. Madison Cole Whitfield left Charlotte. Her consulting business dissolved. I don't know where she went, and I made a genuine, conscious decision not to care. Jennifer Aldridge sent me a long text message full of apologies and explanations. I read it once, set my phone down, and never responded. Some bridges don't get rebuilt. Some people show you exactly who they are by what they stay silent about when it matters most. The last thing I want to tell you is this. About 6 months after the divorce, I was back in Charlotte visiting Sandra for a final paperwork matter. Afterward, I walked down to that wine bar on Tryon Street, the one where I had stood frozen on the sidewalk watching my husband glow for another woman. I went inside this time, sat at the bar, ordered a glass of good red wine, and I sat there alone for about an hour, watching people come and go, feeling something I hadn't expected to feel so cleanly or so soon. Free. Not happy, not yet. Not fully. Healing is not a straight line, and I won't pretend otherwise. But free. Completely, quietly, solidly free in a way I hadn't realized I'd stopped being somewhere in the middle of 7 years of making everything perfect for a man who was quietly planning to discard me. My father called while I was sitting there. Just to check in. Just to hear my voice. "How are you doing today, baby girl?" he asked. I looked around that bar, at the string of lights above the counter, at the couples laughing, at the city moving outside the tall glass windows. "I'm good, Daddy," I said, and I meant it. "That's all I needed to hear," he said. We talked for a few more minutes about nothing important, his golf game, my mother's new garden project, whether I was eating properly. Normal, ordinary, beautiful things. When we hung up, I finished my wine, left a generous tip, and walked out into the Charlotte evening. I did not look back. Some women fall apart when they discover who their husband really is. I found out who I really was. And it turned out, I was my father's daughter after all.